else is so kind to not speak, then it's fine.
As long as everybody else is there. We're gonna do a sound test. Watch on the side. It's a break. Everybody get over one seat so that it's simple.
Okay.
You can say.
All right.
Before there were three ways now, she's amazing.
Kayla, can you hear me talking?
Yes, but I also hear 10 other conversations going on.
We're gonna be talking. And by the way, you guys are so loud online, so be quiet. We can hear you guys. Paul Solomon and all those other people. Shh, be quiet. We're trying to learn. Even on mute, we can hear Paul. Your silence is deafening. Okay, we're gonna learn a little Torah. Shabbat, yeah. Are you? Ein baya. Lo shamati. Mamash. In the Shania. Okay, you guys are in the section over there that needs to be a screamer. All right. Lots of fun happening here. It's hot. We're all delusional. The humidity is getting us. Oh my gosh. All right. The week before Rosh Hashanah. A week from today, God willing, will all be being written into the book of life. The Sefaria sheet is both linked, but also is the PDF. Could you also drop the PDF, Michaela? And you might have done that already. Oh, now Shimon's MacBook is doing. This is interesting. Oh. Okay, hold on one second.
Is he upstairs?
Yeah. It used to be, just sit down in a room, open up a book. What was the technical difficulties? Like we didn't have enough books. All right, so we're gonna wait for a second as Shimon. In Romemu's next building, which Haba'alin L'Tova, we're gonna have like the high tech. It's gonna be high tech, or maybe low tech. Who knows? Next building is probably across the street for at least for a while. How's everybody? Do people know each other? Let me introduce all of you. My dear friend Nehemiah, Radia, Rodrigo, Ricardo, of course. Rod. 1 second. Okay, so whoever's watching Barbie. Okay, we're back. Let's quickly do this before we lose you guys again. So let's do the Griffiths of Torah and make our way. Michaela, that's your cue. Okay. Michaela, can you hear me? Michaela, can you hear me?
Yes, and it will take 20 seconds.
Got it. Okay. Just wasn't sure if you could hear me. All right, everybody. Baruch atah. Oh man. Okay, so let's see if I can bring up the screen. I'd prefer to just do this quickly and see what has been happening, what's going on. I think the PDF is not opening. I don't know if other people having a PDF having a problem opening for some reason. But you can open it here. And share my screen. So just be see this way. All right, until this happens. Ay, da 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 da. Ay, da 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 da. Ay, da 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 da. Ay, da 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 da. Can you all see this? Taking a long time to get it up onto the screen. Can you see it? Yes? No? Can you hear me? Not so well. You can see it. Okay. All right. Like not working, right? Okay, so not me, right? Okay. ויעתי יבוא עליך כל הדברים האלה והברכה והקללה אשר נשאתי לפניך. And when all of these things will come upon you, chapter 30 of the book of Dvarim, of the book of Deuteronomy, the blessing and the curse that I have given you, and you will take it to heart. And all the places where God has dispersed you to those places, and you will then return to God, to Hashem your God, and you will listen to that voice. You and your children, all the things that I've commanded you today, with all of your heart and all of your soul. That's the right. That is the second usage of the term v'hashevota, or and you will return. And then verse 3, v'shav Hashem Elokecha et shivutcha, and God will return all of those who had been dispersed. Shivutcha is also another like connected to the word those who are in exile. And v'richamecha, and God will have compassion for you. V'shav, this is the fifth use of the word shav. V'kibetzcha v'kol ha'amim, and God will return you and then gather you in from all of the nations, asher fitcha v'shama, into all the places that you've been dispersed. Yet another, right? It's slightly redundant, but again, and then these beautiful verses that are very much a part of the Jewish liturgical tradition. In verse 4. If all of your dispersed people will be in like at the far edges of the heavens, right? Or even from there, God will gather you in, and God will take you. And then verse 5, and God will bring you to the land that you have as a Yerusha, as an inheritance from your ancestors, and you will then inherit it. And you will be dealt with in well, and you'll be even more numerous than your ancestors were. And God will then circumcise your heart and the heart of all of your children to love God with all of your heart and love your soul, in order that for your own posterity, for your own life, for the sake of your life, or for your life itself. And then all of the curses that were given to you will be placed onto your enemies that were chasing you. And God, and then you will return and listen to God's voice and do all of the things that you had been commanded to this day. And then verse 9 is, and you'll be blessed again, all of the work of your hands, the fruit of your loins, the fruit of your womb, the fruits, your animals, and the fruits of your field, everything will be litova, for good. Ki yashuv Adonai. And now God will return, or God will return this. God will return now to have joy in you, l'tova sher sas alavotecha. In the same way that God rejoiced in the ancestors, God will now return, as it were, and rejoice in you, because you have, verse 10, listened to God's voice, to observe the mitzvot and all of the commandments that are written in this Torah. Ki tashuv, and then this final returning, which I think at this point is 9 or 10. Ki tashuv el Adonai elecha b'kol levavcha v'kol nafshecha, because you have returned now to God with all your heart and all your soul. This chapter 30 is known as chapter of tshuva, the chapter of tshuva, because of the number of iterations in some form of the verb to return. The word tshuva itself means to return, and it's usually in the sense of a moral or penitential returning, right? And so this becomes like, the chapter 30 becomes like, oh, this is the tshuva chapter. And the hallmark of it, of course, is that it comes after the previous chapter in the Torah, which has to do with what will happen, the quid pro quo, if you do not listen to God's voice. Meaning, this chapter of tshuva is itself predicated on exile and suffering that is the result of your not having listened to God's voice. And so tshuva now is contextualized in chapter 30 of the book of Deuteronomy as directly related to the alot, to the curses that men, when you finally do return, instead of them being about you, they'll be about, right, the others, the ones who are running after you. And so the theology of return here is interesting and slightly problematic, perhaps, but it is kind of predicated on suffering. Tshuva is a result of suffering of some kind, either suffering that is illness, suffering that is persecution, suffering that is ghettos, suffering that is, exile in particular, right? Suffering as an antecedent or a precursor to some version of listening to God's voice, heeding God's voice, and being in alignment with what God expects of us. Now, that theology might not be your theology, and we're going to look at a couple of ways to work with that. But I wanted to just surface it because there are a lot of beautiful ways to work with it, even if you don't believe that the intentional usage of suffering in order to get somebody to behave in the way that you want them to is a moral or ethical way to go about getting what you want, or helping somebody. There are lots of different ways for us to frame this, and I think it's important because I think it is, whether we like it or not, it is a truth. Tshuva is often the result of some version of suffering, right? Whether you think it's God who's doing it to you, or your own behaviors, or what you received from your ancestors, or your childhood, whatever it is, often what wakes us up and brings us back to God, or whatever you want to call that, in our tradition, God's a 4-letter word. And so we don't worry about, the G-O-D. For us, it's Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. It's God is being itself, reality as it is. There's also 3 letters, but one is repeated importantly. So not yet, but yes, in a second. Let me just look at the chapter that is usually taken to be a late edition. Chapter 30 envisions a time after the curses have fallen upon the people of Israel, and they finally return to God. So after all of that, right? This is where in source number 2. The sources are the source numbers on here? Oh, they are. Great. Okay, great. This restorative vision is followed by Moshe as returning to his audience and finishing his exhortations with a rhetorically moving appeal. You'll see we're not reading that right. Second, in this section, the key root is life, occurring 6 times. It is a fitting ending to Moshe's regular speeches. Also noteworthy is the 7-fold use of Hebrew shuv, return, restore. It's more than 7. 7 in a particular form, which was important to those who look for those patterns, but it's even more than 7 times the word. Shva is not counted, and so on. It's the most important word or the verb of returning in some formula. That which is lost will be rediscovered. That which has been in exile will return. And so I'm going to come to this in a second, but first we're going to pause for Theo's question.
Okay, so in the beginning of the part, God or Moses is talking to us. It says, you have to do this, you have to do that, not only you, but also the convert, also the person who is not doing. But it also says, even those who are not here. What does it mean when it says, even those not here? The ones who died in the desert, the future?
The traditional understanding of that is that it's the future. That means even the future generations have been included in this covenant.
Wow.
I call witness to you today, you are all standing here. And to bring you through a covenant, and the covenant is binding also on future generations,
But if it's the
which is a
future,
problem too, by the way.
If it's,
There's a lot of
but
rabbinic.
if it's the future, they're talking about converts who
Yes,
are not Jewish, are they talking about everybody, or they're talking about Jews in the future?
I mean, I think that the simple meaning is that this community, right? This community and those who will attach themselves to this community, right? And those who will live in the land and be a part of this covenant. The covenant was not only a religious covenant, the ancient Israelite religion is also a civilizational covenant. So whomever will be living in a land that is governed by this breach will be like this Constitution of the United States is binding not only on those who are here signing and ratifying it, but also all future generations of people who will come through, and live here will be bound by the same Constitution. So I think that's the original way that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, getting hot and heavy in the room here. Go ahead, Nikki.
Is there another word for repent?
Is there another word for repent? To repent is tshuva. That's the word, teshuvah, to return. And that's why often people, I remember growing up in the frum world, in the Orthodox world, they hated the word repent. They would say it's a goyish word, and it's not a real word. It's not a Jewish word. Repent, which of course, whatever. But tshuva, but what they were trying to say was that something is lost in translation. Because to have multivalent Hebrew say that repenting is also returning is a healthier way of understanding the process, right? Something that has been lost is now being returned is better than penitence, which is my penance, what I owe, what I have to pay, right? So it's more about repair. Repair is a better word, but if you could find a word that has repair, repent, return, all wrapped up in one, it would be tshuva. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Any other questions from all over? We're curious. We're gonna look at this notion of suffering as a precursor to tshuva. Okay. And it's been hot in my life in many ways in terms of pastoral care with people and so on. It's been hot in my life because I just feel like it's such a powerful frame, and I don't like sometimes the frame, and I want to discuss how we repair the frame together. This is taken from a part of the Talmud that is dealing with suffering and its reasons potentially, and also what one does with it. It's a very long part of the very first pages of the Talmudic tractate called Brachot, and this is one of the pieces. Amar Rava, this is source 3. V'item Rav Chisda. Rava said in the name of Rav Chisda, Imro Adam she'yisurin ba'im alav. If a person sees that suffering is coming on them, yifashfesh b'ma'asav. The person should literally means examining or moving around their deeds, meaning like you should start delving into your actions. So yifashfesh means to let me see what's going on. In other words, reflect on how you might be in some way the source of some of that suffering, meaning your actions in some way are bringing that on you. Now, they quote a verse in the book of Lamentations. We will now look into our deeds, our ways, and investigate. And then we'll return to God. So the way that the rabbis read that verse is to say, look, before we return to God, let's look at what's going on. What suffering is coming in some way, and we have to look inward and figure it out. This the theology of this again is reminiscent of Deuteronomy. Can you hear me, Batya? Every other word? Mostly. Okay. So this phrase, look at our actions and then we'll return to God, is the same theology, right? It's because the assumption is that someone is causing suffering, and it's in order to wake us up, right? And so if only we figure out what we're doing wrong, then we'll return to God, and God will receive us back, and the suffering will end, right? And that, let's hold that for a second, because the Gemara gives another story. Look at source number 4. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Chalash. There's a story about Rabbi Chia bar Abba who got sick. Now, this story is a story of someone whose suffering is, at least in the context of the Gemara, there's no sense that this person's done anything wrong. It's kind of suffering that comes for no reason. Whereas these people in this Talmudic piece are considered to be extremely righteous, and they've done all this work and they're figuring out, and then they're still suffering. So Talmud addresses, wait a second, you see really righteous people for whom you can't say, oh, that person deserves the suffering. How could this person be suffering? So the Talmud introduces this crazy idea called Yisurin Shel Ava, that sometimes, almost like a bodhisattva, will take on the suffering of the world in order to purge the world or cleanse the world. This person is suffering without any clear proximate cause, and maybe their suffering is actually, in some sense, they receive intense reward for this suffering, as it were. They're kind of like they are holding. Like if anybody saw Green Mile, anybody ever see Green Mile? Like one of my all-time intense movies, right? Where that gifted man was able to, gifted man was able to like touch somebody and take in their whole life, right? And then metabolize it, right? And transform it and transmute it into healing. I have to bring that up. And so like that image is the image of somebody who is so porous that they take on the suffering around them. And then like in this story, this Rabbi Chia Bar Abba was taking on the suffering, and he was suffering. And his friend Rabbi Yochanan came to him and said, are your suffering, is it dear to you? Chavivin alecha yisurin. Are you like, is it like, can you handle the suffering? Like it's, and he says in this great line, Lo hein v'lo scharan. I don't want them, and I don't want the reward that comes from them. It's like, thank you, but no thank you. Like it's too much. Like I can't, it's too much. Amar le havli yadcha. Such a great line. He says, give me your hands. He gave him his hands, and he lifted him up. Which means like that Rabbi Yochanan was a great healer himself, and so he took his hand and healed him, and he lifted him up. Then the Talmud says, wait a second, now look what happens. Rabbi Yochanan Chalash, Rabbi Yochanan, the healer, also becomes sick. Rabbi Chanina, and he went up to see Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Chanina rather came to see him, and he said, is your suffering dear to you? Meaning, you're suffering, you've taken on suffering in the world, but is it too much for you? And he says, yeah, it's too much. Too much. Yeah, I'm suffering too much. Rabbi Yochanan lost 10 sons. Rabbi Yochanan lost 10 sons. Talmud reports. He says, too much. Lo hein v'lo scharan. I don't want them, and I don't want the reward. Amar le havli yadcha. So now apparently Rabbi Chanina is also an incredible healer. He says, give me your hand. And he lifted him up. So now the Gemara, in its own inimitable way, we're in the middle of this very moving story. It says, its logical mind can't help but like intruding, because it was like the birth of this kind of logical, now analytical mind, even in heart moments. It's like, but wait a second. I don't get the story. You ever get people like that? You're in the middle of telling this really important story. They're like, wait a second, I didn't track the story. I'm like, so they're like, wait a second, Rabbi Yochanan was the healer who healed the previous rabbi, and now he's sick. Why can't he heal himself? He should really heal himself. Why does he have to go to this Rabbi Chanina character? Then the rabbis, they say this incredibly important line. Ein chavush matir atzmo mibeit asurim. When you are in prison, you can't get yourself out. Like if you're in prison, doesn't matter if if you built the prison yourself, it's very hard without someone else to get out. And so this moment, like just tracking here. So we have this first invitation, which is suffering comes after the curses of chapter 30 are, right? The curse of chapter 29 give way to the tshuva of chapter 30, which is return to what you suffered, all these things. And after you suffer those things, now you'll return. You were in exile, now you will return, right? And the Talmud says, well, in general, when you see suffering on you, that is an invitation to look at your deeds, which is kind of like what Deuteronomy said, right? Look at your deeds and check and see. And then the next Talmudic segment says, well, sometimes suffering comes for no reason, and that is just the way of it. And in order for us to be able to handle that suffering or to end it, sometimes we just have to ask somebody to give us a hand, meaning to be in it together, help us be like to get out. And it isn't dependent on our actions. The only action we can take is saying to somebody, I'm suffering, and can you help me? Right? And those two things in some way, right? So I want to look at in a way, I think that there are two levels of suffering, and there are also there's a tikkun in a way. You'll see this in a second. On the way, there's a fixing of the framing of the dangers, the shadow of it's my fault that I am suffering, which might be framed slightly differently. Generally, everybody. So just raise your hand. I promise I'll get around. But like, and it's like when you do that, you've already like not. Yes, go ahead, Theo. It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so Freud talks about the shadow and the
Yeah,
darkness.
yeah,
and the
yeah.
point, the point of it. Do you think there's something about this that is saying that that suffering, that dark place, on some level is required because of our holy place, like that somehow God lives in this dark place and we have to go and like redeem it.
We're gonna go. Let's follow Theo into a book by Harold Kushner, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Source number 5. Now, there is the assumption, of course, is that when bad things happen to good people, that's a problem. But when bad things happen to not so good people, that's not such a problem, right? The theological problem arises when good people suffer, but when people quote unquote who are deserving of suffering, there is some notion like the presumption of the problem is that there is a moral dilemma when punishment comes on someone who doesn't deserve it. But that, of course, frames punishment as sometimes deserved, right? Like, and that's why the problem arises. Wait a second. Like, if you live in a world where punishment was always a problem, then you wouldn't say when bad things happen to good people, as the title of the book would be, when bad things happen, period. Right? Because then that would be like, why do bad things happen at all? I mean, I don't believe that bad.
Believe it, Rabbi.
Right?
Sorry.
Is it gonna be sitting here or like it's the wrong way? Okay, I didn't think the landscape. Okay. I'm just thinking like these things are happening. It must be something that I did. I don't know what's wrong with me. I was kidding. When bad things happen, why bad things happen to good people, Kushner offers suggestions of a rationale, the rabbis. And these kind of the rabbis are giving 5 basic reasons why bad things happen. One of them is what is called the grass versus palm metaphor. It's in Isaiah, it's in the book of Psalms. Over time, right, the palm grows bigger, meaning God has reasons, and eventually we'll find out we are now in, right, the grass, meaning this notion that we don't see the full picture, right? In other words, one way to say it is that really says it's not really bad, right? It's bad now, but eventually it won't be bad, right? So that's one way to work with when bad things happen to good people. Right? There are 2 sides of a tapestry, suffering of, that again, it's another optical, like what looks bad now will one day not look bad. That's another way to work with it, right? The 4th one is that suffering is a contribution to the greater whole. We can only see the messy side of the tapestry, not the finished product, right? So as part of that, right, again, similar to the first one, it's that we don't have a big enough vision. It kind of ask the question, is it really bad? Is it really bad? It might be bad now, but it might not always be bad, right? That kind of thing. I don't like the way that these were numbered, but whatever it is, there is another one, which is God is a parent providing punishment when necessary, and we learn the wisdom of why later. And these are all kind of in the theology of the Torah and in the rabbinic understanding. God wants to help us see how strong our faith is. There's another, God tests us to see how strong our faith is, right? Suffering comes as a test. We've heard that one. God will be bringing us to a better place. Another one. And then there's the ever-ready one, which is God doesn't make evil or suffering at all, but God is ready to guide us when we are ready, right? In other words, suffering comes into the world. It is a part of the world. There's nothing, right? And God, as it were, as the totality of all things, is there as a source for support, but not as the causative agent, as it were, for the suffering. Now, some version of that, by the way, lest you think that Buddhism gets us anywhere with this. Buddhism also has its version of this, right? The general understanding of Buddhism is that karma is suffering comes into the world because of karma. So what is karma? Karma is the general belief that every effect must have an antecedent cause. There must be, which is rational. There isn't anything that isn't a result of something that came before it. And therefore, if you suffer, it must be that there are causes that are causing that suffering. The cause it might be in this lifetime, or it could be extended in many lifetimes. But whatever is happening in this lifetime is in some way explainable by some cause that preceded it. Now, again, it's a complicated topic. And I think that eventually the rabbis and the Buddha are not interested in who makes us suffer. Eventually, the rabbis and the Buddha and others are not interested in, like, if there is a why for the suffering, but rather, what is the suffering, right? What is possible from the suffering, and what can be made of it, and how might we end it? Amen. Now, in that framing, right? In that framing, of course, the first Talmudic dictum, right? If you see suffering come upon you, look at your deeds. Is not look at your deeds because they are the ones that you're being punished for, right? But look at your deeds because your life might be the first place to start to see if you are the cause of your own suffering in some way, shape, or form. Is it your thoughts? Is it your speech? Is it your action? Right? Right? And then the question is, it's not look at your suffering because you're a bad person. It's look at your suffering because, as Levinas said, where was Levinas? Source number 5. If anybody wants to read an amazing theologian grapple with this, the inimitable, incredible, life-changing work of Rachel Adler, when bad things happen, who is a completely remarkable force. Levinas said, yes. Levinas says, the only moral response we can make to suffering is to do all we can do to alleviate it. In fact, only in being present to the suffering of other people do we become completely human. It is upon us to relieve the suffering wherever the ravaged face of the other lifts itself to ours, to yours, even when we ourselves are suffering. We can leave ourselves open to compassion and to hope by the practice of lament and by a life of active caring. Now, the practice of lament is also something. The practice of lament, which she's referring to, which people who are my students know this, is one of my Torahs, and I've been teaching this for 17 years. According to the Protestant theologian, we're in source 7, Walter Brueggemann, the lamenter refuses to present a compliant false self to God while repressing her genuine feelings. Instead, the lamenter confronts God with the immediacy of suffering in a way that renders retribution unjustifiable. We have here 2 moments that are, I think, for me personally, very theologically resonant and consistent, and I feel aligned with them, which is, there is suffering that we experience in our own lives and in the lives of the world that is, in some way, we look at it and we say, there might be antecedent causes that are not divine, but completely human. Like, I might be causing my own suffering. And in that sense, when God says in chapter 30 of the book of Deuteronomy, after you have suffered all you have suffered, you will then wake up and come back home. I get that. I get that. I get that. I don't think, oh, you did that to me, Hashem, God, you did it. I get like, oh man, I know that I make choices that cause me suffering. I know that I have habits and patterns that I know of and have known about for a long time, but like sometimes I'm like, okay, whatever. And then I wake up and I say, okay, oh man, I just caused myself and others suffering. I know often it's in acts not only of commission, but of omission. Things that I know that I need to do, or that will be healthy for me, like that I'm avoiding. And that even avoiding, my reasons for avoiding it can become a game. Like if I would just sit with myself and say, hey, sweetie, why are you avoiding making that phone call? You know how happy it'll make your mother. You know, whatever. So we have all list of all kinds of, non-theological causative agents that are not making us quote unquote bad moral individuals, but on some level are completely out of alignment with who we are and want to be in the world. Like that totally, when Sir Bahavi said that, it said, if I favor myself, I'm like, and when the Basile's assurance, I was like, right on. Yeah, I should be looking at myself. And then there's a place where I look at myself for suffering or in the world, and I say, no, that is not acceptable suffering. Like no one did that. And that should actually elicit in me the practice of lament, which is to irk myself. That should irk me. And I should find my voice to say that is not suffering that anybody deserves. That is not the kind of suffering that anybody deserves. And in that practice of lament, I also recognize my own responsibility to participate in alleviating that suffering to the best of my ability. Right? There's something happening that's wrong, and my job, as the Gemara says, is to reach in with my hand and ukme and lift them up, or lift up that situation. Right? To look, for example, there are systemic pieces, right? And there are people who say, that certain groups of people, right, are not doing enough to help themselves, right? They're not doing enough, they blame them. And first of all, there might be truth to that. I think we Jews, we do that quite a bit. We say we're causing our own suffering. Why are we doing, if you're on the left, say if you're on the right or left, whatever, they'll say the government's not doing enough, or this, certainly blame ourselves for suffering that we cause as a collective. And at times others will come along and say, how dare you blame those people for something that is not their fault? But rather, right, let's figure out a better way to think about this, right? I know, I see the hands were coming. I'm excited because it's cooking. That's good. We're getting some more hands. Let's just hold on for 1 more second. Then if you can wait 1 more second. And then we're going to open up for the Zoomers who haven't yet spoken either. Remember, we have Zoomers and we can't see them because of technical stuff today, but we'll get to you guys in a second. 1 more moment. I want to present 2 countervailing voices. One is the voice of Elie Wiesel, and maybe the voice of Viktor Frankl to come in here as a countervailing voice, or maybe not. We'll see. Just one last thing. Elie Wiesel wrote, the survivors of the Holocaust are aware of the fact that God's presence at Treblinka or Majdanek, or for that matter, God's absence, poses a problem which will remain forever insoluble. Right? Those who were there say we'll never figure it out. Right? Never. Viktor Frankl, who also lived through it, just like Elie Wiesel, wrote this. And they're very different because one uses God as God is in the question, and God is noticeably absent from Frankl's formulation. He says, in some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. Now, if I put these 2 voices in dialogue with one another, I think that maybe Wiesel was saying you can never, ever again use God as the meaning making of something as horrible as the Holocaust. Like, don't bring God in. Like, just let that be absolutely unknowable and a mystery, and don't say God did it. Like, none of that language. And maybe some people will say to Frankl, and Frankl might say, you're right, but find another meaning for it, right? There might be another meaning for the suffering. And in a place like the Holocaust, Frankl or Wiesel might argue there could never be any meaning, and so it will always remain suffering in that sense. It will never, ever escape, the suffering that it was, the tragedy that is the unspeakable horror that it was. But in some way, Frankl, though, is pointing beyond that to our own personal life, saying that when we do find meaning for our suffering, it actually it reframes it in some way. It reframes it, and that's exactly what I think the rabbis were trying to say. And in some sense, let me stop there. Like, okay, enough. Okay, let me just stop the share. Let's see all the voices. I'm sure hands are up everywhere, although I can't see. Where did it go? Okay. This is not working for me today. Yes. I can't even see if there are hands up. Like, I literally can't see if there are any hands up here in the at all.
Maybe there's none.
Okay, maybe there's none. We'll walk it. That would usually comes up here on the right. It'll show up. Okay, maybe I'm not all the way at a time.
There are no hands raised. Yeah, there's one hand raised now from Paul Ullman.
There's no pressure on anybody. There are plenty of hands raised here. We're gonna start in the room and we'll go to Paul. I see Paul's hand. Okay. Batya,
My hand up. You said it.
okay,
Karma.
Karma.
And I just want to say that I reframed, that's another one of your words, point. I reframed a lot of what was going on for me early in my life. With the whole concept of karma, and it was less suffering.
It was what?
And in addition to that, I'm thinking that the rabbis have an issue with karma, I think, because it's something that they allude to very often, that you hear it in a previous life and so on and so forth. So reincarnation comes into Judaism
Also,
from the side.
yeah, totally. Totally.
Why would they not have done that? And what use and what devastation from the concept of could be to Judaism is that you will not take care of the rest of your life and thinking, well, this is, coming to me or whatever. I don't know why it's never been more emphasized or accepted.
So we're not here to fix or understand all of Jewish theology. There are many Jewish theologies, and that's why we saw with Hare Kushner at least 5, maybe there are more, 6, 7, 8 different theologies, and some of them work for certain people, and some of them work for others. And I think that there is a theology in Judaism that is exactly this: what is suffering, inviting, framing, and how do we lift one another up, and maybe even making meaning is the wrong frame too. I think that Viktor Frankl's making meaning of suffering is what ends it, is one frame also. Like, I think that maybe sometimes trying to make meaning of suffering can itself be a way to not alleviate suffering. I think that there is a way that suffering in the purest sense of today's Torah portion is there as as a wake-up call, but that even that is a meaning making. In other words, the choice to use suffering as a way to wake up is a choice, right? And some people can legitimately say, I'm not going to wake up the suffering. I'm first of all going to keep suffering, or I'm going to fight this suffering, or I'm never going to be okay with suffering. I didn't do anything wrong. There's no, it's not trying to it's not trying to wake me up. It's just pure, it's just the way the world works, and I'm not learning anything from it now. And some people also, it's very nuanced. I think I'm saying in a way that's, I think, not nuanced. It's nuanced. Some people say, listen, I had a health scare, and that to me is a wake-up call, because I can see a direct relationship between the choices I make for my health and my suffering in terms of health. Some people might not see that as, if you have, I'll give you an example, you know, my family and I struggled with a child who had, people in the community know this, we were trying to figure out something that was going on with with our eldest son Bear for many years. And thank God it's all great now, Baruch Hashem, but like we went on for years. And like, I don't think at any point that I thought that that it was intended in any way to wake me up to something. But my response to it was, in trying to respond to it with love and compassion and with a commitment to alleviating that suffering for both him and our family, I can see in retrospect that suffering deepened me and made me awake to a lot of things that I was not awake to before. And in that way, suffering can become retrospectively, if one chooses that path to alleviate in a particular way, you will then be able to say, I woke up more deeply from that suffering, but not that that suffering was sent to wake me up, because that would feel really, I mean, it just feels like I don't want to give it that much. It just raises too many questions for me, and I don't want to be in those questions. I want to just be in the fact of it and how I responded to it, and with others too, because if I ask that question about myself, I also wind up asking those questions about my fellow human beings. Like, what did you do that you have a mental illness in your family? Ugh. Ugh. Oh, Gewalt. I could never. And I know people who do that. And it's legitimately a theology, even if it's legitimately morally repugnant to me. So I kind of want to stick with, and we're going to get to hopefully two more little teachings. But first, we need to give the room the Zoom also some koyach here. So let's go to the Paul in the Zoom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you. So interesting. I'm sitting here thinking about the relationship between return and turn. And it seems like there are three states. There's a, if you will, a superposition where you're in between returning and not returning. And that is the moment of decision of turning. And it can be a very lovely, but it's unstable. But I think we should, or at least I'm trying to imagine the act of turning and playing with that, because it's a choice. You can return or you can not return, but it's an unstable place to be. You have to make a decision. You can't be in that position for very long. That's it.
So I'm hearing you saying that returning is a choice, that turning, I'm trying to understand the difference between turning and returning, because in my mind, the assumption of the text is that there is a place that is the stable place, which is the place of being at home, being in alignment with God, whatever that might be, and that the people are aware of the suffering that is in the state of alienation, exile, of being not returning. And so
that there's a place in between a blessing and a curse.
yeah,
There's a place of decision to either be worthy of a curse or worthy of a blessing.
I see.
It's an interesting place. It's worthy of being in that place, of thinking about the fact that one has agency, one can choose to live a life that's worthy of curses or worthy of a life, or a life that's worthy of blessing.
I see.
It's within our power, and it's
right.
empowering to imagine one having the power.
So you're focusing on the Moshe here with the people in the desert before these predictions come true, saying to them, you will come to a point where you will have before you blessing and curse. And I am imploring you to choose blessing, and to in that moment where you can go in either direction. And you're saying that's the turn. That's the moment of turning towards blessing, of being worthy of blessing versus being worthy of curses. That's what you want to focus on. Right?
Because Moses is standing in front of a people that have twisted and turned. This isn't the first moment. This is a moment, many times this happened before.
Right.
And Moses is not only talking about this moment, but he's also talking about all the prior moments and the moment of the moment.
Right.
Yeah, that's it.
Right. So I want to lift that up as we make our turn and return just for a second to these two last texts. And I see there are a lot of hands, but like I just wanted to just make sure that we want to just respond and return, because responding is also a kind of returning. Literally the same word in Hebrew for returning is an answer, to give a response, and the responsibility. And so I really wanted to say that to Paul's point, that one of the things that Moshe might be thinking about as he's saying this morning to us, and said it, thousands of years ago to them, was one of the reasons a person might think, I can't return. Like Moshe is talking to people that have turned and returned and turned and returned, turned and returned. And he's going to say to them at some point, I'm hoping that you will make that turn towards blessing and not towards curse. But then this whole chapter 30 is basically you inevitably you're gonna do it again, and I know it. But lest you think that when you fall again, that God will not be there wanting you to come back. The entire chapter 30 is God will be there to receive you. In fact, maybe God was there with you when you were in exile. And so source number 12 from Rabbi Meir in the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, when human beings suffer, what does the Shekhinah say? My head is too heavy for me. My arm is too heavy for me. Right? God is grieved over the blood of the wicked that is shed. In other words, God cries for all of humanity, and certainly over the righteous, meaning God's compassion is not exhausted only for those who deserve it. God is compassionate even for those who don't, meaning that the Shekhinah is with us in every moment, saying, I'm with you as you make your turn or return, and I'll be with you when you are back and you can have that choice once again. This final Hasidic teaching is from the Mea Shiloach, the great Rebbe from Ishbitz. The Rebbe from Ishbitz says this. I'm going to finish with this Hasidic Torah. When all these things will come on you, and the blessing and the curse. Why does it say the blessing and the curse? Right? Blessing and then curse. He says, he says that sometimes, not always, but sometimes inside of God says, when all of these things, the blessing and the curse, habracha v'klala, he said v'haklala, it says, because sometimes hidden in the curse was a hidden blessing. Sometimes. He says, sometimes. Right? And that's why it then says, he says that inside of, that all of this returning is not returning to the land of Israel. It's not returning to, some place, some shrine. It says turn the thing over and over again in your heart and ask yourself, in the aftermath of a curse, what was the hidden blessing, that might have been there? And you might find that there was none, he says. I find that there was nothing there. But as you return the thing to your heart and you sit with it, you say to yourself, like I told you with my own child, was there something that, because of that challenge, because of that difficulty that was born in me, that had it not been, I might not have learned that. I might not have seen that. Now, that takes time. It's certainly not, often it's not in the midst of something like that. It's available to us almost never, almost never. And in fact, sometimes when we're in the middle of something, it's kind of interesting in the Torah this morning. It's not, we recognize it after we've been in exile for a while. And something says, oh, wait a second, I hit rock bottom. Wait a second, I'm so far, I got to come back. And then there's that moment where we might be able to learn there a place. So I'm gonna stop here. I know there are a couple of, I want to also get to some people, we heard, I want Kim to go and then go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, thank you. What was missing for me is actually that last piece, and something that you described in your experience with Bear is that in my experience, suffering, it can open your heart or it can close it. And if it opens your heart, there's an opportunity to deepen in compassion and feel more connected to other people.
Yeah.
To be more present. And I've also noticed as a therapist that oftentimes there are parts of ourselves that have been exiled that we don't have access to. And when there's a crisis and when there's suffering, it sort of shines light on that exile. It allows us to get in touch with the pain, that that deep, old, young pain, and to heal it. That otherwise, like our protectors, our shells would be keeping that energy out. And so there's an opportunity. This is just, I've noticed, like working with, as a therapist with clients over time, is that there's usually when something happens, it is an opportunity for them to deepen into these really young, exiled parts of themselves and heal them so that they can unburden themselves of whatever they've been carrying for so long and really just return to the light.
Amen.
Yeah, I love that. I think that in the context of tshuva as tshuva as return, or tshuva as healing, or tshuva, all of the things, we said the word for tshuva, the word for repentance, it brings that possibility that you just offered us, which is that sometimes it really, the question is, will our heart open to this suffering or not? And sometimes, and not always, because this can also become a bit of a mind trip. Like you're saying, I'm opening, but I'm not getting it. I'm opening, I'm not getting it. And so it becomes a kind of open for the sake of not to get it, but because the other choice, which is, as Paul said, like to go towards the path of curse, which, some of this language is very difficult, but like towards the path of a closed heart, which has its own pain and it's kind of like a doubling. It's not only am I suffering, but now my heart is closing, or my mind is closing, or my, any of these other things are closing. And that can be such an intensification of what already is a very painful reality, right? So and then this last piece that you brought, which is around exiled parts. And I think over the last month in my class on tshuva, I've talked often about how I'm using music these days, because I've been playing guitar now for almost a year, 9 months, and I'm really loving it. And about how you tune up your guitar, right? The attunement, and how there are a lot of theologians who talk about attunement with God, like being in tune with the divine. And we can say the same thing about ourselves, like tshuva is a process of attunement, right? And that atonement and attunement, right? Atonement and attunement, there's a sense that atoning is to be repairing and to reharmonizing this instrument. And it hurts our ears, right? When we're dissonant. And when things are out of tune, it can be a painful experience. And that tshuva is a process of rediscovering like what it would be if the instrument that is you and your life was freed to be in attunement, right? And to be in attunement with others. We're gonna take one last comment, from someone who hasn't spoken, and who's been here from the beginning and didn't interrupt and eat potato. I'm kidding. Okay.
Nice.
Nicely played. Very nice. I want to be in attunement with you.
I think the Torah definitely believes in karma because in the Torah it says like when people do transgressions that the result of it will be placed upon multiple generations to follow, which is basically karma going forward. The other is
I interrupt before you finish that. Say the next thing in a second. The rabbis have a very deep problem with that. And in fact, the rabbis undo that.
Oh, okay.
Right. The Torah has no problem saying that the sins of the fathers will be visited upon the children,
Right.
but the rabbis do have a problem with it. And in fact, not only that, later, like a later prophetic voice, in Ezekiel, also is a problem with it. So like internal to the Torah, there's its own maturation around whether or not that is a morally sustainable or morally defendable position. But what one can say over time, it never left the Jewish people, the sense that, and we know this in our own experience, right? Parents do bequeath their unlived lives or their unmanifested elements or their unhealthy elements to their family systems. And so there is a deeper truth that the Torah was alluding to, if not, let's say, around like that I have to pay for my father's, X, Y, Z. So go ahead, Wendy.
I'm just talking about the Peshat.
The shot.
And the other thing is Akiva's notion, like, there is a midrash that when he saw the temple destroyed and he saw all these animals running in and out of the temple,
Fox, yeah.
he laughed.
He laughed. Yeah.
And he said the greater the sorrow, the greater the joy could follow.
Right. So I'll unpack that and then we have to close. Is that okay? Can I unpack that? So what Wendy's alluding to is a midrash that says that when Rabbi Kiva and some of his and other rabbis were living at the time of the destruction of the second temple, when they witnessed the desolation, they were walking on the Temple Mount together and they witnessed the desolation, they began to weep, his colleagues began to weep. And at that moment, a fox walked by and Rabbi Kiva saw it and he began to laugh. He laughed. And they were incredulous that he was laughing. He was standing on the site of the Khurban, of the 9/11 of the Jewish people. He was standing at ground zero and he was laughing. And they said to him, Rabbi Kiva, how could you be laughing? And he said to them, do you believe in the prophecy that was prophesied that this temple would be destroyed? And they said, of course we did. We're looking at it. He said, the same book that prophesied this destruction also has in it a verse that says one day there will be foxes that are roaming there. And in that place where foxes will roam, a new vision will be born. And so you believe the first vision, you have to believe the second vision. And the greater the sorrow, he said, the greater the jubilation that will also one day occur there. And I think that's a part and parcel of the broader meaning making of the Jewish people, which saw in great suffering often a potential seed for one day there being greater light or greater redemption. I'm going to leave that as part of the general meaning making of suffering that we Jews have done for centuries, and that in some way, as Viktor Frankl said, helped us find meaning in what often was meaningless suffering. It seemed to us when the Crusaders came through and slaughtered women and children in the Rhineland, we Jews had to make meaning of it. Otherwise, we would have probably disintegrated. There was really no way. We were powerless. We were helpless. We thought that God had chosen us, and yet here we were suffering. We didn't know what we did wrong. And like children, we had to find a way to make meaning of it. And I believe, though, that the seed of that, which is, I think, very alive in what Kim said and what all of us have been saying, to look at suffering as an opportunity to open our hearts, to look at suffering as that choice between blessing and curse. That choice is available to all of us in our lives in some way. And that every year when we read this on Parshat, the week before Shoshana, we are also, in Moshe's presence, and he says to each and every one of us, behold, I place before you today the blessing that is in the curses, the blessings that are potentially in the suffering. First of all, look and see if maybe you could change something in your life that might alleviate your suffering and others. Fight for those whose suffering is undeserved and have a moral voice. And lastly, but not maybe most importantly, that no matter where there is suffering, open your heart to feel it and to breathe with it. And even if you don't know its meaning, maybe you can alleviate it just by giving your hand to someone or some part of yourself that just wants to be seen and sat with. That's also the power of tshuva. So with that, we thank Michaela all the way from Brussels. We thank those whose hands were up and who I'm sure would have lifted us with your brilliance and your insights, and we love you. Tonight will be slichas at 9:30. I'll be doing teaching. We'll probably do it here in this area as well. And then we'll go upstairs for the full slichot, the full beginning of the week before Shoshana. And that'll begin at 11 o'clock tonight. If you're not coming to slichas tonight, find a slichas near you. And slichot means to ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness, the beginning of the path of forgiveness, forgiving. And if you're not yet signed up to be with us for the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, please do that so that we know where you are. And Yasher Koach to Ethan, who made the sheets, and to all of you here for showing up as you do. What a beautiful presence. All right.